Hi, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, our weekly look at the news from around the world. And joining us today is Bobby Ghosh from London, who's joining me the first time. Bobby is the Bloomberg opinion editor at Bloomberg Opinion. Bobby, wonderful to have you. Also,
Thanks for having me.
Also joining us from Washington, D.C., Karen DeYoung, associate editor and senior national security correspondent of the Washington Post. Karen, wonderful to have you back.
Hello.
And Matt Kaminski, who is editor-in-chief of Politico. Matt, wonderful to see you again. Well, it is in Washington all about impeachment, but in the rest of the world, more happening. And indeed, even in Washington, more is happening on foreign policy. So let's dive right in, Matt, on I think we're starting for the first time the beginnings of what the Biden administration is thinking about when it comes to relationship with China. Of course, today is the Lunar New Year, the year the ox started. We've had our first phone call between President Xi and President Biden, and a number of early indications of where the administration wants to take this relationship, which is so central not only to U.S. foreign policy, but to global politics. So, Matt, how do you see this evolving relationship, and what does it start to tell you about the Biden administration's approach to the world?
I think we have a little bit more clarity on the approach to the world, but certainly on China. The White House had started about a week ago signaling a message that's going to approach of patience on China. Biden called a dozen plus other world leaders until he talked to Xi. Tony Blinken waited until he talked to his counterpart. But we ended up the week with the message being, this is a relationship of quote unquote extreme competition. The Blinken phone call was very frosty. Biden's phone call with Xi was a little bit less frosty, but still very frosty. And it was notable that the administration is really leading that we see China as first an adversary, second a competitor, and third maybe there are areas where we can cooperate. Not a break in the last 4 years, where Donald Trump was China hawk without any equal. So that is going to be sort of the element of continuity with the previous 4 years, where China is seen as America's main competitor in the world. I think the slight change is it's obviously less blustery. So one is the volume level is been lowered down. So two, I think the approach is that the Biden administration is really trying to lean into saying, well, what are America's greatest advantages in its relationship with China? One is its alliances in the world, in the Western world, but in Asia as well. Biden did call Modi, and India would be a partner, Thailand, Philippines, Japan, obviously, Europe potentially. Two, it is sort of taking a more multilateral approach to the world through the UN. And three, let's lead with our values. To what degree can the value of democracy and being a good player in the world help us in trying to kind of push back China? The last thing I just want to sort of add on this is that this is indeed novel. There are obvious challenges that are emerging. The allies are not united. Half of Europe primarily wants to do business with China. China has been very good about dividing America's allies on the China question. Angela Merkel is not in the Biden or Trump camp on China, and I think that will be a test. And lastly, they will be tested in the region itself. It was the China Straits. It seems inevitably, even going back to the Clinton administration, that this kind of becomes a kind of an early test of an incoming administration on Asia policy. So I think tonally it's different, substantively is not that different, and the challenges remain the same as before.
Karen, how do you see it? If I sum Matt up, yes, strategic, extreme competition, but we're going to do it through multilateral institutions, alliances, and letting our values sort of drive the policy. Is that a fair description of both the policy towards China and perhaps the foreign policy approach of the Biden administration, all of 3.5 weeks into the administration?
Yeah, I think that's basically it. And one of the key things is that, which they've emphasized in various briefings and public statements, is that we think Trump did some things okay. He had this sort of right idea of competition, adversaries, but that Trump was tactical. We are going to be strategic. And in that strategy, we're not going to do anything really fast. We're not going to do anything about tariffs right now. We're going to let them sit there because we're reviewing. And again, as Matt said, we are going to consult with our allies and we're going to play to our own strengths. And those strengths are, in addition to values, they say, look, we have technological strengths, we have industrial strengths, we have infrastructure strengths, but all of them have been let sort of slide under the Trump administration. And we don't want to do anything really fast until we figure out just where everything stands. And they've also emphasized, we recognize that things are different than they were 4 years ago. China is much stronger than it was then. But we have the capacity with our allies to more than match them. But let's be strategic about this. Let's think about how to do it. And, they're under a lot of pressure to do something pretty quickly, but they've been pretty tough in saying, one of the I just wrote down a quote, one of the senior administration officials who briefed reporters this about it said, look, we can get everything right in China policy, but if we get our own policies in terms of infrastructure, in terms of rebuilding this country wrong, then we're going to fail in China as well as every place else. So again, a lot of pressure to do something quickly, push back. They're saying all the right things. Yes, China's an adversary. Yes, we're going to stick to our values, but we're not going to do anything precipitous until we figure out exactly where we stand.
Bobby, how does it look to you from across the Atlantic as you observe what's happening in Washington, and by the way, what's happening in Europe and in London and Europe as well, as people start thinking about how do we drive this relationship? How is the relationship going to drive them over the next few years?
Yeah, I think the advantage of being out here is that it gives me a different perch on issues like this, and I'm looking to see. I take Matt's point and Karen's about the change in tone from Washington. I'm waiting to see a change in tone from Beijing, and that hasn't happened yet. The wolf warrior diplomacy that Beijing has unleashed over the last 4 years, where its diplomats sort of come out and say and tweet and posture in the most aggressive possible manner. That hasn't significantly changed, and I don't see that significantly changing. So when that changes, then we'll know that discussions between the two administrations have, perhaps through back channels, have reached a sort of meaningful stage. We're still very much at the sort of circling each other warily and trying to see where we can sort of take a little nibble, a little jab stage of this. The Europeans, as Matt pointed out, can't get their house in order about this. They've got very, very different views. Merkel and this is also true about Russia, but particularly about China. Merkel takes one view. The Eastern Europeans need Chinese investment, need that whole Belt and Road infrastructure, take a even more pro-China view. And then you have the Brits, who are somewhat farther away from Merkel, and then you have the French, who depends on what day of the week it is. So I think the attempt to understand where our allies stand will take some time, because our allies are sending us very, very different signals. The allies in Asia, obviously, because they are directly under the shadow of China, are more anxious, and they have something approaching a consensus, at least in terms of anxiety about China. So that's India, Thailand, Philippines, Vietnam significantly, the Koreans, and Japan. And all of these countries would, I think, like to see much more sort of a much more lean-in posture from the United States. The Europeans, like I said earlier, the French want to play, and the Brits to some degree want to play a role in containing China, even in East Asia. And the French Navy has a presence there, the British Navy has a presence there, and they see it as part of their strategic objective to align themselves with Australia, New Zealand, India, and of course the United States, to see if they can contain China. But it's all much of a muchness at the moment. There is not enough clarity.
And indeed, the Brits, I think, are sending an aircraft carrier, one of the two that they bought down to the Pacific, both American airplanes, because they don't have enough money to buy planes to actually fly from those aircraft carriers. But hopefully that'll change over time as well. Matt, I want to come back to you on a point that Bobby raised and then added to something that you've raised, which is where is Xi? Where is the Chinese Communist Party, and where is the Chinese view? We had in Washington one of those titillating things. In fact, you published in Politico magazine an article called "The Longer Telegram" by anonymous, a former senior official. Identity remains anonymous, arguing that we really need to base our policies on the internal structure of the Chinese Communist Party, much like George Kennan argued in the 40s about this. That was also the view of Pompeo and of the outgoing administration. A very strong view that what you had to talk about the Chinese Communist Party as the threat. It doesn't seem to be the same at the in the administration, and certainly, and this is the point where your comment come in. That's not how many Europeans see it. Particularly Merkel is not looking at China as a Marxist-Leninist threat, but rather as an economic market opportunity for Mercedes and Audi and Volkswagen. How serious should we take this internal piece in deciding how to move forward on our policy?
For mentioning that piece, I think what was so interesting to us about it, and people should feel free to read all several thousand words on our site, and there's a fuller 30,000 word version on the Atlantic Council site from this. And the argument there that was striking, and I think relatively original, was the conversation shouldn't be about how do you remove the Chinese Communist Party from power. That regime change is the wrong goal for a Western strategy, containment or of China. And I think what the author was pointing out that I hadn't seen quite put this way is that the West's problem is not the Chinese Communist Party, it is President Xi. And President Xi sort of marks the break with the post-Deng approach that you have sort of technocrats running the party, and we are in a situation where we're just trying to make a lot of money together and are not. That Xi has brought a much more aggressive, nationalistic and authoritarian in a kind of quasi-Maoist sense approach to his leadership. And that if you look inside the Chinese elites, there is a quiet discontent, and the West should sort of look to exploit those tensions within the Chinese elite, because in the American and let's say European, as Europe being Britain and France, not Germany and Italy, interest it is to probably see a different leadership of a communist China, because this communist China led by Xi, who a little bit in the Putin mold, sees himself as being vulnerable, and his response to his vulnerability is to be more aggressive. That is a direct danger to our interests and ourselves. I think we're probably at the very beginning of a conversation about what the grand strategy on China should be in the U.S. And it doesn't seem to me sitting from afar, but that was certainly my impression when I was in Europe 2 years ago for several years. But there was even a beginning of a conversation about what a European grand strategy should be on China.
Yeah, and Karen, just to add, it's not clear that at least our European allies, maybe our Asian allies are different, and Bobby can jump in here as well, of course, but our European allies at all are in this mode of thinking about the internal dynamics of Chinese society. It doesn't strike me that they're spending a lot of time thinking about those, let alone have these kinds of discussions that have been going on now for about a year or so here in the United States. So what's driving China in order then to figure out what your strategy should be?
Well, I think to follow up on what Matt said, it's the Trump administration was so focused on saying we are the people who are tough with the Chinese Communist Party. Everybody else is weak. Pompeo never actually spoke about China. It was always the Chinese Communist Party. And he claimed that one of the big victories of Trump foreign policy was that it had awakened the world to the danger posed. I think the Europeans had, last year had said, look, at one point, we need to sit down and talk about this. And they were pretty much ignored by the Trump administration. And so I think that dialogue, to the extent it's gone on at all, has gone on completely separately. And one of the things the Biden people want to do is say, look, we know that you have a lot of different views about this, as opposed to the Trump administration saying, yeah, you have views and you're completely wrong. So we're going to take charge. I think that's what the Biden people are trying to do right now. They may, as Bobby said, they may not come to any great agreement. And certainly the Europeans have gone, moved toward a trade agreement with the Chinese themselves. I think that Biden is trying to make good on what he said. Look, if we're together, we're much stronger, and it doesn't have to be completely our way, but let's come up with some kind of joint position on this.
Bobby, in Asia, does this kind of discussion about what is driving Chinese policy in particular, is there a leadership or an ideology piece, or is it just power, the structural reality of a rising China? How does the Asian debate take account of this, or is it just not part of it?
It's a big continent, and it depends on who you ask, but if I were to try and attempt a sort of grand sweep sort of position, it would be that we don't have the luxury of thinking about the nuances of Communist Party internal politicking. Maybe the Japanese pay a little close attention to that, but on that, not too many. I mean, the Indians certainly have a very superficial understanding of the finer points of Chinese politics. It is mostly about power and power projection. The Vietnamese, the Philippines, and just as in Europe, they have different points of view on how close they are, not just to China, but how close the People's Army is. So the Indians right now are having conniptions because in the past year, the Chinese military has taken over essentially hundreds of square kilometers of what India regards as its territories in the Himalayan high altitudes, and India has not been able to come up with a response that Modi would like, because Modi sees himself as being a tough guy, while China is exposing the weakness, the weak underbelly. In the Philippines, they're under Duterte, there is almost a resignation about China and its ambitions in the South China Sea and in the islands that the two countries contest. And the Japanese, of course, have the Japanese and Koreans have the deepest economic connections into China because their giant corporations have enormous manufacturing infrastructure. And so the views when they're expressed, can more diplomatic finesse, but the underlying anxieties, I think, are pretty common. I forgot to mention Australia. Australia in the past maybe year or so has had a quite significant turn in its attitudes towards China. I think for a long time, the Australian political establishment took the view that China was the big market, the big buyer of Australia's raw materials, and therefore that was too important an economic relationship to allow any sort of political unhappiness to get in the way. I think there's been a reassessment there. You hear Australian politicians taking a more forceful attitude towards China. All of this has been taking place in an environment in the past few years where there's a perception of the US being, an absentee landlord. And I think all of these countries are waiting to see, after the Biden administration has cleared its throat, what exactly it is going to say. How tough is it really going to get with China?
There's a little footnote sort of worth mentioning in the readouts from the various calls, is that as tough as Blinken was with his Chinese counterpart, when he called in the calls to Thailand, to the Thai and the Filipino foreign ministers, human rights were not mentioned once, or concerns about democracy. So there does seem to be an obvious effort that you gotta figure out who your friends are in the region and try and organize them against China.
That's a great segue, Karen, to staying in the region, to Myanmar and the coup and its immediate aftermath, and it really is posing a challenge, and not only the Biden administration, but also the countries in the region, about the balance between our values and democracy and human rights on the one hand, and dealing with an important actor that for 50 years has been under military rule, and the exception is having a modicum of democracy rather than the other way around. How does the Biden administration look at that, and where is the attempt to bring together other countries, our allies and friends, to address this issue?
Well, I mean, you're right. It is a really good segue because, China is Myanmar's biggest trading partner. The Chinese want to make it a significant part of the Belt and Road Initiative. They want an outlet directly into the Indian Ocean. And to the extent that there's political feeling in this country that perhaps will crack down too hard on Myanmar, it's all about China. It's all about, do we want to, be in a position of pushing them toward China because we're not interested, and we're going to crack down. And if you go back to the original opening under the Obama administration to Myanmar, that was, it was, yes, you are transitioning to a democracy after long military rule, but it also was about China, to allow US businesses in there, to allow humanitarian aid, while still keeping, a sort of patter up about human rights, but basically, come over to our side. They've always been wary of China, but we didn't want to push them in China's direction. However, in this case, where the Biden administration, as you said, had to make a choice between values and its larger strategic goals in the region, they've come down pretty hard against Myanmar. It's interesting to compare it to Obama with Egypt and the whole question where they went on for months and months in 2011 to say, was this a coup? Because once you say it's a coup, then you have to do certain things under the law. But they moved very, very quickly with consultations, called all the allies, this week declared it a coup, and yesterday imposed pretty heavy sanctions on the 10 top military and former military leaders, sanctioned 3 of the large military economic entities in the country, and I think that, again, they've really fast. I think to send a message to say, we're not going to put up with this. We're not going to dither. We recognize things are different. We mean what we say about values. So whether this will be the case, in similar situations or not, I don't know. But they clearly have made that choice with Myanmar. So,
Bobby, how's it seen in outside the United States, both in Asia and in Europe? Is this seen as the fundamental new values first kind of foreign policy that Biden is pushing, has talked about, or is this seen as a strategic move, or just how is it seen, and what are other countries thinking they should be doing themselves?
I think in Europe there is confusion, but the Asians take a very particular view. See, the idea that Biden can bring together a common purpose around Myanmar is problematic, because Myanmar's immediate neighbors, aside from China, India, Thailand, are and have historically been perfectly happy to do business with the junta. Democracies, though they may be after a fashion, less so now than before, they're not really pushing. You're not hearing strong language from the Indians or the Thai asking for the return of democracy, or for the release of the imprisoned democratic leaders, and so on and so forth. The crucial voice here, and it'll take a little time for that voice to be heard, is ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. For ASEAN, Burma, Myanmar is a very big issue, and we forget now. But the opening that took place during the administration was only possible because of years and years of ASEAN diplomacy, the old junta. And Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State, was able to swoop in after the ASEAN leadership set the terms of the gradual handing over of power from the military to the democratic parties and to an election. I think, again, the voice, there is a voice that matters in Myanmar on the other side of the spectrum from China. That's the voice. The ASEAN leadership at the moment is a little weak, shall we say, because the big ASEAN countries have their own problems. The Thais, of course, have their own sort of military-dominated state of affairs. The Malaysians are going through a period of internal disputation. So it'll take a little longer, I suspect. It may take several months or a year even before the ASEAN countries have figured out what their common message is, and before they can begin to start working on the new junta. But I think I keep my eyes on ASEAN rather than, I think, the Biden administration has said its piece, and there's not a lot more it can do or say, having almost have come close to the nuclear option. I think now the play will take place in Asia, among the Southeast Asian nations.
Just to make sure that the nuclear option is figurative rather than literal.
Yes, I should. Yes.
Just to underscore this for all of those who are watching, Matt, is that how you see it? It's sort of the statement has been made. It was an important statement to make in order to emphasize the importance of values and democracy and human rights in American foreign policy. Put some sanctions on. They're significant for Myanmar, not particularly significant in terms of cost to the United States. And now let's move on and maybe help ASEAN to the extent one can, but really move on. Is that how we should look at the Myanmar episode? Even as, of course, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people are still marching in the street in Myanmar in support of the democratic leadership, which in an election got, 85% of the vote just last November. How do you see it?
I mean, I think it's an interesting to see. You're seeing the pictures from, I guess, Nepal, Yangon, and Burma. You're seeing what's happening in Russia in response to Navalny, the protests in Turkey. So there is in countries that Burma, Myanmar was never a democracy. It was a quasi-democracy, and now it's reverted back to its more natural state, at least in the public imagination or the policy imagination. I think there's across the world in these kinds of countries that are troubled, and you will have some elements of instability. In terms of American policy, you're absolutely right. It happened to be the first of the Biden administration coming in, but it is a very small one, and I don't think we'll be thinking or talking about it very much in a few weeks.
And I think one of their, the Biden people keep saying, under the Trump administration, the United States abandoned its role in these regional organizations, particularly in Asia, and didn't use them in order to form a coherent policy. And they've sort of pledged that that's what they're going to do. So I think it makes sense that the locus of action would be in ASEAN, and that they would want to, again, having said their piece, work through the regional organizations.
Although I think that makes sense. I think the only literal thing that was done was a G7 statement. So that's the big powers coming in from the outside on the issue. And I don't know whether they tried getting an ASEAN statement, but ASEAN would have to do, and I think, as Bobby says, it's going to take some time just because it's pretty tricky for the organization itself to talk about a member, which after all is what Myanmar is of ASEAN. But speaking of test, and sort of Bobby, the big immediate test, yes, Myanmar was one. Yes, it was the one. But the one we know is coming is Iran. And time seems to be running out on trying to figure out how we can get the Iran and the United States back into what both countries say they want, which is back into an agreement that was negotiated in 2015 and which the Trump administration departed in 2018. How do you see that challenge? What do you hear from what's happening in Iran, where some big steps continue to be taken every day? And of course, what do you hear in Washington? And here, the Europeans have a leading role and have had a leading role for a very long time to be at least partners with the United States on this issue.
Well, the Iranians are very keen, of course, that the United States should get back as quickly as possible. And they are trying to gain some leverage by ratcheting up at least the rhetoric around their enrichment program. It's now immense that they're not just enriching uranium, but they're producing uranium metal, for which there is no serious civilian use, and its primary use is in weapons making the bomb. And the Iranians are trying very hard to hustle, essentially, the US back into the program. I think the Biden administration has played it very well. It has communicated, and Biden did when he was a candidate, that it wants to get back into the program, but it is also showing a certain calm and saying, we're not in a rush to do this. We want the Iranians to get back into compliance with the JCPOA, which is what the nuclear deal was called. And we're happy to talk, but those are the terms. While doing that, there's a lot of other optics that is taking place that is not directly linked to Iran, but has a strong bearing. So the US has taken, under the Biden administration, has frozen out the Saudis and the Emiratis, has put a temporary hold on arms sales to them, has taken a position on Yemen where the US will not support offensive military actions. One of the first things the Biden administration did was drop the Muslim travel ban, people from several Muslim countries. All of these things have a bearing in that nobody can accuse the Biden administration the way the Iranians can't accuse the Biden administration, as they were able to do with Trump, of being in the tank for the Saudis, right? And that's not unimportant. The fact that he hasn't given Bibi Netanyahu a call in Israel is something that arouses a lot of merriment in Tehran. And I sort of follow a lot of signal groups and blogs where there's a lot of fun being had at Bibi Netanyahu's expense in Iranian circles. So the Iranians can't accuse Biden of taking sides. They can't wish away the fact that Biden has said that he's happy to make a good faith effort. Now the ball is very much on their court. At the same time, when the Biden administration, I'm assuming behind the scenes, and Karen being in Washington will have and Matt will have a much better sense of this, is that presumably there is some sort of second degree or third degree of separation, discussions taking place about either with the Iranians or with their proxies about how to move forward. I think eventually they will have to come to some sort of an arrangement where each side begins to get closer and closer to full compliance, but the Biden administration wants to hold out for more than simply going back to the old JCPOA. It seems to me from this distance that they're trying to, if not a JCPOA 2.0, the JCPOA plus deal. And there is some attempt to rectify what I regarded as some of the mistakes that were made in the first deal. Primarily among those are the fact that there's an attempt now to pay closer attention to what Iran's neighbors are saying, which the Obama administration didn't fully do. But we'll see. We'll see whether who blinks first, and then what is the roadmap they come up with to get back to the point that both sides want to reach.
Karen, what is your reporting say in Washington as the administration is getting up to speed? They're seeing rapid movement by the Iranians in the wrong direction. What are they trying to do to head that off?
Well, they keep insisting publicly there have been no direct talks at any level with the Iranians, but I think there have been indirect talks on a lot of levels. They have, aware that the three European members of the deal are in direct contact with the Iranians, and there have been indirect conversations in that way. The Europeans have sort of tried to come up among themselves with a proposal that would at least get things started. What could you do on both sides that would allow you to start having direct talks? The Iranian position, the public position is, look, you quit the deal, we didn't quit the deal, you come back in it and undo everything that Trump did after he left it, which most importantly were oil sanctions, and then we'll go back on what we've done in the nuclear realm. And so the Europeans are trying to come up with ways. One suggestion is when Trump put the sanctions on, there was a sort of lead time for Asian importers of Iranian oil, where they said, okay, you have 6 months to disentangle yourself, and some hope that the Trump administration wouldn't implement that, but they did. And so one suggestion is, well, couldn't you look at that and kind of undo that small part of it? Could you go ahead and lift your objections to some IMF funding? Could you push harder with humanitarian assistance through the Swiss, which are really the only ones who maintain a sort of humanitarian channel to send money into Iran? So there is a list of things that can be done. Right now, the public position of both sides is really an all or nothing, and you have to do it first. So I think we're just waiting to see. There was an interesting comment from the Biden administration this week where they said, well, okay, we're not talking now, but it doesn't mean we can't talk. They've appointed a senior envoy, Rob Malley, who the Iranians know pretty well, to start these talks at whatever level. So I think that, again, they're still sort of feeling themselves out. Both sides have a lot of domestic pressure, both to do something, but probably importantly, to not do something. I think that the Biden administration, which has promised consultations with Congress at every step along the way. It's a pretty hard road to travel there in getting agreement to go back into the deal and in fact lift sanctions and to unfreeze mostly to unfreeze the sanctions that have been put on the Iranian funds since they left the deal. They've frozen a whole bunch of other Iranian funds through these secondary sanctions on other countries doing business with Iran. That's another thing they could do. They could find a way to make it clearer than was ever done, even more sanctions to European companies, that it's okay to go back or to start thinking about going back into Iran. So there are a series of things that do, and there are a series of things that be done on the Iranian side. It's how do they get over the political problems that both of them have, not saying you first, you have to do it all, it's all or nothing.
Matt, ask you on that domestic politics piece that is both important here in the United States and in Iran, where there's an election coming up, and this issue of the relationship with the United States and the relationship with Iran in both polities seems to be as difficult and making it hard to negotiate. So, you're muted. Just to make sure. Thanks.
Thank you for flagging that out. It's, a president has a hand in foreign affairs, except, and I think there are two major exceptions. One is now increasingly in China, which is as much a domestic policy issue as a policy issue for the White House, no matter who is there, and the Middle East and Iran, and that's been the case for decades. You can't distinguish Iran from the Israel question for policymakers, and this is where even the appointment of Rob Malley got a lot of blowback from pro-Israeli groups that he's too soft on Iran. So there will be this is something which is going to play out live, and so Biden will get a lot of pushback, whatever he does in terms of the next steps on whether it's sanctions or working with the Europeans to revive the JCPOA. And I think he doesn't have the kind of, there's a lot more to calibrate here than in almost any other part of the world.
Bobby, when you look at Iran in terms of the domestic politics there, how do you see the constraints on the Iranian leadership there to make the first move or make any move? How is that constraint?
Well, there is a kabuki of Iranian politics, where you have people who we think of as being extremists and people who are less extreme, and a better word we could call moderate. But the fact is that the man pulling most of the strings and the man whose opinion finally matters is the supreme leader. And he very frequently will speak out of both sides of his mouth. And he has done this consistently on Iran's nuclear program, as well as on any association, any engagement with the US. He basically wants all the sanctions to be lifted, wants Iran to have access to all the money that has been frozen over the years, and wants Iran to be able to export oil freely. That's his maximalist position. What we hear from President Rouhani and Foreign Minister Zarif is an attempt to somewhat soften that line, to say, no, let's make a deal on the nuclear issues, and maybe, just maybe, we can talk about these other things that our neighbors and the US and Europe also care about, which is the ballistic missile program, the financing of terror groups and proxy groups, and all the other many ways by which Iran can and does promote and create havoc in its neighborhood. The Supreme Leader has never once said he's open to any discussions along those lines. In fact, he has said over and over again, we'll talk nukes and nothing else. He said that over the long lead up to the 2015 nuclear deal. He said that immediately after the nuclear deal, and he has said it since Trump pulled the United States up. I, for one, would believe him. If he says he's not open to having any other discussions, then the Biden administration should take that as read, that if they go ahead and return the US to the JCPOA, then that's it. There will be no other discussion with Iran. So any hope of getting the Iranians to think about some of these other things is predicated on the leverage of the sanctions. And using that before getting back into the JCPOA. Once you get back in the JCPOA, deal's done, we could say goodbye to everything else.
Well, we won't be able to solve that problem here, but if it gets solved, we will discuss it next week or the week thereafter or whenever it happens on World Review. Bobby Ghosh, Karen DeYoung, Matt Kaminski, thank you all three for joining us, and thank you all for watching. We will be back next week with another edition of World Review. Thank you all.
Bye.